All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's a couple minutes after the hour here, so I think I'll go ahead and get started. This webinar today is a State of the Science webinar on ecological restoration in the Northeast Seed Network. The event, it's part of the New York's 10th Annual Invasive Species Awareness Week. This whole week that started on June 5th, there were events held across New York State to help raise awareness about invasive species. We're so grateful you're all here today. And for those of you here in New York, or those of you that want to learn from our work here in New York, we really invite you to stay active on invasive species issues and get involved with the local partnerships for regional invasive species management, the PRISMs here, which are coordinating groups of organizations and citizens working together to prevent the spread of and management of invasive species. Following this event, we would be really grateful if you would take a moment to complete the online feedback survey. We use these surveys to make sure that the events that are hosted during this week are the most beneficial to participants, and we really would love to hear from you. And if you want to learn more about some of the other events that are going on or Invasive Species Awareness Week in general, we're going to drop the link in the chat box now so that you can access that calendar. The State of the Science webinar has been an annual event that the New York Invasive Species Research Institute hosts. The Research Institute works to connect invasive species research and practice to improve the scientific basis of invasive species decisions in New York State and beyond. We were established in 2008 to span the research implementation divide, to work collaboratively to facilitate research, build and strengthen networks, support our partners' needs, and we are housed, although we're funded through the New York State Environmental Protection Fund that's administered by the New York State DEC. We're housed here at Cornell University in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. So with that, I'd like to move to introducing our speakers for today. We have two great speakers lined up here. I'm going to introduce both of them, and then they will be giving their presentations to follow. But actually, before I do that, I just wanted to mention, if you have questions, feel free at any time to drop them in the Q&A box. We ask that you not use the chat box, but instead use the Q&A box so we can, if any responses are written, they can be directly attached to the question that was asked. And so if you have any technical difficulties, please do text us. And also, if Justin, you could put your email into the chat box. So if anyone needs to contact you, if they get kicked out of Zoom and have any difficulties, they can do that. So our first presenter today is going to be James Aronson. James is a co-trustee of the Global Impact Not-for-Profit Ecological Health Network and emeritus senior scientist at Missouri Botanical Gardens. From 1992 to 2016, he was a member of the Restoration Ecology Group at the largest ecology lab in France. He's participated in ecological restoration and rehabilitation projects in many parts of the world and co-authored many papers and books on ecological restoration. He served for many years as a board member of the Society for Ecological Restoration. So James is bringing us many years of experience on restoration, and we're really looking forward to hearing about that. Eve Allen will also be presenting today, and Eve is a program director at the Ecological Health Network, where she's helping to build and reinforce regional connections to catalyze and build the capacity of social impact networks focused on scaling up ecological restoration in the Northeast. She has a master's in city planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So without further ado, I'd like to pass this along to James and Eve so they can get started. Thanks so much.
Good. Okay, so I'm not going to say a lot about biological invaders or biological invasions, but it is woven into what I'm going to present about holistic ecological. We are a nonprofit working at the intersection of ecological restoration and human health, building on the 35 years of work of many in the Society for Ecological Restoration. We decided to create this not-for-profit to get restoration sites talking more to each other around the world, developing networks of networks, and bringing into better focus intersection in ecological restoration and human health. Okay. So what is it and what isn't ecological restoration is an important thing to consider, trying to figure out it could contribute to an invasive species management strategy, and conversely, how invasive species management fits into an ecological restoration paradigm. So I want to talk about definitions and concepts of various subjects, but all within this framework of holistic ecological restoration and how it can be conceived and applied at a landscape and bioregional scale. As you all know, there's a growing demand for investment in large-scale restoration. Live in complex mosaic landscapes. So how can we go forward with a field that's focused on individual ecosystems that abut one another and interact with one another, and in almost all cases today better described as social ecological systems. So in addition to the landscape perspective, the holistic approach requires that we give serious thought and spend discussing values and determine what are the values shared among the and I want to speak a little bit about the ecosystem of reference concept. I call it a cornerstone concept in ecological restoration that helps to aid in planning and consent building. A lot of cynics or skeptics say, no, you guys are sentimental idiots. You're trying to turn the clock back to 1491 or some other date in the past. That's not the case. It's more nuanced than that. It deals with complex realities. And we're focusing, as I said, in bioregional networking. So basic concepts from the SER, Society for Ecological Restoration's foundation documents, and you have a web link at the bottom of the slide. From the primer and the standards and principles document, 2004-2019, principally restoration, ecological restoration, and degraded, damaged, or destroyed ecosystems, emphasizing the words process and assisting and structure, functioning, and content to allow an easy distinction to be drawn between restoration and rehabilitation. It could be called equal and economic rehabilitation, since it concentrates on repairing functionality, including productivity and the flow of ecosystem goods and services to humans and other components of the ecosystems. And this adopts, by the way, an approach that could be called managing from the inside out. And both these activities, ecological restoration and rehabilitation from the SER perspective, proceed with an historically formed ecosystem of reference. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes. Just to use a couple of pictures worth a 1,000 words, my longtime colleague from Florida, Andy Kluel, who was a professor for 50 and a practitioner for 25 years, was hired to restore a phosphate mine in Florida. Here is a before shot from 1986, and exactly the same shot, same site years later in 2006 with all native species. It would be interesting to have another photo of the same fidelity. There is historical continuity between what grows above and below ground at this site and what moves around in this forest today and extraction process. Next slide. The reclamation, remediation, rehabilitation activities that can be contrasted with restoration because they focus on functionality. Here is a before and after pair of site shots from the high Andes in Peru. The grasses in the second photo are non-native, rapid growth to hold the soil, prevent soil erosion, and provide grazing for domestic camelids. Reclamation or remediation is something that's used a lot in the mining industry, and contamination cleanup. And it's yet another activity that we'll come back to later when I broach the subject of the restoration continuum. And a term that's very much in the air these days and might be worth some discussion in the question and answer period is rewilding. Very relationship right now between this concept and the much more clearly defined concepts of ecological restoration and rehabilitation. Next slide, please. So let's move on to talk about how to scale up and how to put holistic ecological restoration into movement at landscape or bioregional scales, and this notion of talking about shared values, something that sadly is all too often overlooked. Next, please. So what is a definition? A rough and ready or ecocentric objectives with anthropocentric or human-centric, human dimension focused objectives throughout the process. And this is really necessary to us because usually people go in one direction or the other. It's either ecocentric or it's human-centric. And we're arguing that to really jumpstart the kind of major changes and major recovery needed, we should try for a addition or two, combining the two objectives or sets of objectives from the beginning of the planning process. Next. And a takeaway notion to help define restoration is that it's the opposite of degradation. You see here as two ecosystems leading to the loss of native biodiversity and disruption of the ecosystem structure, composition, and functioning, all of which are necessary to ecosystem processes, maintaining health, ecosystem health, while also degradation leads to reduction in the flow of ecosystem goods and services. So there you have another way of addressing this notion of combined ecocentric, anthropocentric perspectives. And as for values, it's not something that can be covered in 2 minutes, but Andy Kluel, in one of our texts, borrowed this 4-quadrant model from philosopher Ken Wilber to apply it to ecological restoration. And if you just look at the names of the 4 quadrats, or the 4 categories of ecological values vis-a-vis socioeconomic values, but if you then also think about the individual values and the collective values, following Ken Wilber's insight, then to consider why would Eve, why would anyone engage in this process of ecological restoration? And what is it culturally? This is an important notion, whether we're dealing with a single culture or, as is increasingly the case, multiple cultures in restoration projects and programs. And please keep going, one more. A reminder, some degradation has taken place, and I refer to human-induced degradation, whether direct or indirect, that 70 to 80% recovery over a timeline 50 to 100 years, let's say 4 or 5 human generations. Thank you. Is about as good as we can expect. 70% recovery of biodiversity, 70% recovery of functional system health in 50 to 100 years is a fairly reasonable estimate of what's possible. And that leaves out 30% that may not be recovered in that timeline. And this has been called by Moreno Mateo the debt. This kind of language makes it possible for accountants and economists to join in the discussion so that decision makers and communities can talk through the whole process and take good decisions. A second reminder.
James, I apologize for interrupting.
Please.
We're having some problems with the bandwidth,
Oh.
and you're cutting out a lot. Your audio is cutting out a lot. We were going to quickly transition to maybe Audrey's going to share your slides. So then maybe without you screen sharing, you'll have more bandwidth so the audio comes through better.
Thank you.
I apologize to our participants for the slight delay, but we just want to make sure the quality is good and we can hear you well.
That's great. Thank you, Carrie. And thank you, Audrey.
How's that? Are people seeing that?
Yes, we
Good.
can see that.
And you think the transmission is better now? Okay, shall I just proceed, Carrie?
Yeah, this sounds much better, James.
Oh, great. Thanks very much. Good. Real world reminder number 2, resources are almost always limited. But ideally, there's planning and consensus building that take place, significant effort before implementing. And maintain the holistic approach that we're advocating for. And ideally, there should be funding and allocation of resource monitoring, and evaluation and aftercare going forward. And not just for 3 years, but for a starting period, we could say for 30 years. It may be pie in the sky, but that's the ideal scenario. Slide, please. And just as one nod to the invasive species issue, and from an ecological and restoration ecological perspective, it's important to note that honeysuckle thickets, for example, create great habitat for feral deer, and the feral deer are vectors for a couple of different kinds of really nasty diseases that affect domestic animals and people. So it's pretty straightforward that the ecological and the human dimensions are intermingled. And honeysuckle, of course, is a huge problem throughout the northeast, sorry. Next slide, please, Audrey. So applying some of these ideas and the techniques, the proven or valid hypotheses in the field of restoration ecology across a wide spectrum of world have shown that it is possible to make significant and assist significant recovery. And you'll recognize here in this image, but the important issue here is the landscape scale of diversity and complexity, and the message that different interventions can and should be selected and implemented simultaneously at the landscape scale to achieve the best holistic results. And needless to say, I'll be happy, and Eve and I would be happy to forward PDFs of all of the papers and chapters we're citing in this for those who want to look more at these ideas. Next. A great example from the Northeast that can never be too recalled is the New York City's efforts starting in the early 2000s, restore and rehabilitate, reintegrate the all of metropolitan New York and its watersheds. And it chose to work with the farmers and landowners in the Catskill and Delaware watersheds that feed its reservoirs, instead of just building more water filtration facilities in New York City. A marvelous example of the kind of holistic ecological restoration we're advocating. Next slide, please. You see, we're talking about city as well as rural. If we could reduce our damaging and degrading societal impacts on the ecosystems upon which we depend, this would be part of restorative continuum or restoration continuum, and improving our ecosystem management to reduce waste, reduce pollution, etc., 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 is also part of the restoration continuum. Repairing ecosystem functioning in farmlands and every other landscape unit that we use, and repairing loss of function from the past, as well as the things further to the right, initiating native recovery, partially and fully recovering native and all social ecological systems are all part of a single continuum, and the use of this adjective restorative is very helpful to help us understand the large-scale vision and activities that are needed. Next slide, please, Audrey. And this is part of a global condition that we live in today. We hear about it all the time. It's hard to keep it in the front of our minds, but here are just a few statistics summing up, thanks to the IPBES, what's our current and the United Nations, happily, next slide, please, Audrey. Yeah, the United Nations has gotten turned on to the enormous contribution that ecological or ecosystem restoration can provide at national, international, regional, municipal, and local and landscape degradation, loss of ecosystem health, and climate change all together. And as you may know, that we're in the midst of a UN decade on ecosystem restoration. So there's an enormous national up of attention. And a great need for greater networking and interaction. Audrey, next slide, please. Thanks. And here's another schematic that we've been playing with, bringing climate chaos and the need for greater climate stability onto one thing together with the goal of ecological health and the goal of human health and well-being.
I said at the outset that this is wickedly complex, and this image that some of you may know from paper describing novel ecosystems in 2006 is very useful to describe what's going on in the world today on a spectrum or continuum wild in between inverted commas and intensive agro fields. There's a huge area in the middle now of what I prefer to call emerging ecosystems. And not much is known about them, and not a lot of thinking went into the management of them and for this process. And that includes management of biological invaders. So now, I promised to talk about briefly, and about which a lot has been written, and various examples can be illustrated and discussed. But the key points are these. If you start a restoration or rehabilitation project on a degraded site, time go your baseline. But the reference ecosystem is something that you either select or that you assemble from various sources to provide a kind of model or benchmark or a lamp to the future, or other tools that you might want to use about your planning, where you're looking in the rear view mirror on the one hand, try to understand how degradation took place, what happened at the site, the scenario of degradation and formation, and what you'd like to see recovered, what we as a team would like to help or assist the recovery of going forward. And this is an extremely useful technique and tool set for getting people on the same page. The consensus building that I referred to at the beginning. We can come back to this, but I want to go through to the end of the slides now and turn it over to Eve. So Audrey, please let me have the next slide. The cultural component is increasingly coming into focus. I mentioned that I lived for many years in southern France, and there's a wonderful interplay between culture and nature there, as throughout the Mediterranean region. And this series of famous paintings and drawings of the iconic Montagne Victoire been used as a tool in a reference development after major forest fires devastated the mountains in this area. Next slide, please. Here in the eastern, northeastern USA, there's the whole colonial and pre-colonial and post-industrial history, the layered history that is different than that of Europe, and was captured by Thomas Cole to a certain extent in this famous painting that's at the Museum of Metropolitan Art, and that was inspired by the writings of Emerson. On the left, you have the wilderness, and on the right, you have the landscapes created by the colonial settlers. And part of what may be needed to holistic ecological restoration at large scale in this region today is to really come to terms with the past and the present and what we'd like the future to be like for our landscapes and our ecosystems going forward. So this is just a stimulus for discussion, this image. And the next one, please, Audrey, is somewhat similar. In the Southeast, until the 1790s, there were still open grasslands, savanna and meadow mosaic landscapes with bison, but not trees as we plan our way forward and as we plan what to do about individual invasion and all of the other things needed to address. And for those who are interested, there's some literature about this. Go back one, please. This slide is multi-reference system idea, binds ecological or ecosystem goods and services into a single schematic that allows work on a of an assembly system of reference over time. So I'll stop there and look forward to discussion, but now turn the microphone over to Eve.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear us okay? My name is Eve. I'm going to be speaking about the Northeast Seed Network and how we are working to leverage social connections to enhance bioregional regeneration. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So today I'll talk about supply as social networks. I'll talk about a research project that we carried out last year that was helpful in developing the Northeast Seed Network, how we collected data, our analysis of that data, some of the implications and key takeaway messages. I'll talk about our process of launching the Northeast Network for the past year, our next steps, and how you can get engaged. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about supply chains as social networks. Next slide, please. And the supply chains that I'm referring to are for seeds of native plants, and containerized plant material. Next slide, please. In the Northeast, like many other parts of the world, we have a poor representation of species in commercial supply chains and the commercial nursery trade for many different habitat types. We also have insufficient availability of genetically appropriate plant and seed material for many of those species, and we have lack of adequate quantities. And this is a real bottleneck to advancing ecological restoration in the wide range of allied activities in our region. Next slide, please. And so in the Northeast, land managers and practitioners are mostly buying seed from Midwestern seed suppliers. And in 2018, there was a survey done by the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank and the University of Maryland that found that on average, seed buyers in the eastern United States are buying from vendors located 418 miles away from their restoration sites. In our research, what we wanted to do was understand more about seed and plant material supply chains. And so we looked at the international literature, and really these issues have been common all over the world in places where ecological restoration is taking place. But what we found is that starting in 2015, numerous articles and planning documents and technical reports started to advance a conceptual framing of agricultural production systems to increase seed and plant material as a supply chain. And this conceptual framing to describe the interrelated stages, inputs, outputs, flows, and resources related to those production systems. Next slide, please. However, in our review of this literature, we realized that these articles don't draw from a very long and developed field of supply chain management that originated in the late 1980s to understand how to transfer raw material into final products and goods. And a lot of the articles depict the production systems as a series of linear steps or as a circular chain of activities with a very limited number of stages and flows. And so next slide. We started to look into the literature of supply chain management, and we found many different articles, but I just want to highlight one here. These authors reviewed 400 articles from the body of supply chain management literature, and they grounded their conceptual framing of supply chains as networks of interdependent relationships developed and fostered through strategic collaboration with the goal of deriving mutual benefits. Next slide, please. And so this allowed us to bit more about a different framing for understanding seed supply chains, and that this framing of a network of relationships might provide a better foundation for carrying out analyses about how to plan and strengthen seed and plant material supply chains in our region. Please. So moving into our collection analysis and implications, we did a case study of the Northeast region. We looked at 9 states, starting in Pennsylvania, going all the way up to Maine. And the thing that we did was we generated a list of 157 different social actors or network nodes in 6 primary categories. These included government, private companies, seed suppliers, botanic gardens, private design, road firms, many educational institutions, and many nonprofit organizations. And we sent everybody a survey to collect network data. We asked them to rate their level of collaboration and connectedness to all other 156 actors on a scale from 0 to 3. So 0 would be, I've never collaborated with that actor before, whereas 3 would be, we collaborate on a regular basis. Next slide, please. And then we used social network analysis, which is a domain of scientific investigation, looks at social structures through the use of networks and graph theory, and is really great at understanding network structure at an entire network scale, subgroups at a subnetwork scale, and central players. Next slide, please. We use, which is an open network analysis and visualization software, to analyze our network data and gather insights about the constellation of social actors who have stakes in strengthening the seed and plant material supply chain in our region. Next slide, please. And move into the next slide, please. So here's an image on the left-hand side of the social network and all of those 157 actors. I understand it looks quite messy and complex, and that's because it is. What we found is that the network has a core and periphery structure. where in the core of the network are primarily end users of native plant material. These include government agencies, state-level agencies, build and design firms, and on the periphery of the network include who are actually the seed suppliers or the plant nurseries. Next slide, please. And we also were able to understand what type of bottlenecks occur from a social network perspective. And what we found is that social relationships between the producers of native seed and plant materials and the consumers within the region, those links between them, those relational links, are far and few between, except for one Midwestern seed supplier in Minnesota, which is at the center of the network. We also were able to understand who within the network can act as central players, can act as intermediaries, or help to broker exchange between and among the network well connected and integrated. And what we found is that nonprofit organizations, especially those working on open land and endangered plant conservation, have the potential ability to act as and foster trust on previously disconnected groups. Also, I want to point out here, size of the dots or the nodes in the network indicate the relative importance in the network. So here you can see that our producers in green are much smaller than the nonprofit organization in blue. And that's the same also with the end users of native seed and plant materials. Next slide, please. We also were able to identify the most influential nodes in the network by category type. And we found that influencers, or that can help the behavior of other network members, primarily include state-level government agencies, along with nonprofit organizations. Next slide, please. We also looked at subgroup formation and found that there are subgroups within the larger network. However, only 3 of these subgroups contained producers of native seed and plant materials. But we also found that in one of those subgroups, there's pre-existing social cohesion that exists between plant nurseries, seed suppliers, and botanic gardens, along with nonprofit organizations and educational institutions that work on horticulture and landscape architecture, which is interesting because these are network relationships that could be leveraged to help build supply chain capacity. Next slide, please. So what are the implications and takeaway messages of this research for supply chains all over the world, but also in the Northeast? Next slide, please. Our results demonstrate that restoration seed and plant material supply chains are not necessarily linear or circular, and they don't have just a few main stages or key components, but they're actually quite varied, and they're actually complex social networks. Next slide, please. And we believe the term restoration supply network more aptly illustrates and better captures that complexity and the tendencies, the bidirectional flows, the central players, the subgroups and plant material supply chain. Slide, please. And for the Northeast, building a seed and plant material chain or increase capacity of what are in the region, we need to do non-organizations because these are well positioned to broker, exchange, build and connection across the network. As book level agents to be involved, they have very reaching influence and they can have behavior practices across the network. Next please. This makes sense. State level agencies would be important players in the United States. Settlement patterns.
Eve, we can't hear you
Awesome.
right now. Oh, now you're back.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Carrie.
No worries, and I can hear you again now.
Okay, so what we've been doing over the past year is bringing together social actors in the Northeast. There's been many groups that have been working on generating supplies of genetically appropriate, source identified seed and plant material. And we wanted to reinforce existing connections among these groups, but also build connections with new social actors. And so we've been doing targeted outreach, holding convening meetings, holding team group meetings, communicating with many different players in the region. And last March, just a few months ago, we formally launched the Northeast Seed Network at the National Native Seed Conference in Alexandria, Virginia. Here's an article that you can read more about it if you look at this link. Next slide, please. The network leadership, I just want to touch on this. This is a joint collaboration with the Native Plant Trust. And the Native Plant Trust is going to be working on the coordination of the network. We are going to be working on building the network's capacity. However, we are a growing network of many members and partners. The last time we checked, we had 65 plus people in our network, and this number is growing. Next slide, please. Of the North Network is to build trusted partnerships across all of the seed and plant material supply chain steps to increase the accessibility of genetically appropriate, source identified wild plants for the ecoregions of the northeastern United States. Next slide. And our boundaries, I would say they're not strictly delineated, but they're porous. And instead of firm borders, we have many hotspots of activity across the region. But this map shows generally the areas that we're working in. We're not working in all of these regions right now, or ecoregions, I mean, but this is our vision, that we'd like to have this spatial extent. Next slide, please. And our vision is really to enhance communication. A lot of people are already working and have been doing similar things, and they're not 100% aware of what's happening in a pretty close geographic scale to them. And so we want to make sure that we can enhance communication, but also increase capacity for coordination and collaboration, and build a community of practice so that we generate best standards and practices across the network, and relay and translate international and national level guidance to our regional actors and our local actors. Next slide, please. We also want to make sure that this isn't just specialized leadership, but we're developing distributed and developing a cooperative structure that fosters communication and coordination, and also self-organization. Next slide, please. Our network is together many different actors across different sectors who work across different scales and many different capacities, from academic institutions to private companies to citizen groups, government agencies, tribal groups, nonprofit organizations, youth, researchers. We want to also make sure that there's space for farmers, mid-scale farmers, and large-scale farmers. And we really think that we need to have this inclusive network structure because the activities that are taking place in our region are varied. And to make sure that the supply can match the demand, we need to think comprehensively about all of the various stakeholders that we need to bring into this network. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing since we've been a form work. Have divided ourselves into sub-working groups. And one of the, I think, first and most significant achievements of working together as a network has been developing a target taxa list. And this group addressed the recommendation 2.1 from the assessment of native seed needs and the capacity for their supply, which was a report that the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine published earlier this year, that really we need to start developing region-specific lists of priority species that can producers of native seed and plant material to focus on the same subset of species versus the thousands that are native to a region. Next slide. And so over 5 months, we brought together 28 different individuals from the supply chain. We had botanists, seed collectors, landscape architects, nursery professionals, and we developed really a system of generating consensus about how to prioritize species for first pilots of seed collecting, seed storage, and seed increase. And this was really important because we want to make sure that we can build the capacity to coordinate our activities. We'll never be able to collect all the seeds that we need for range and number of activities that are happening in our region from remnant ecosystems. So it's really important that we take a coordinated approach, and developing this species list was a first step to do that. So we found 67 taxa and 29 genera, and this is just, again, a first phase of developing a list like this. All of these species, for example, can be stored using orthodox methods. They can be dried and stored at those mid and long-term storage. So we recognize that there's many other species that are written for eco-restoration activities that are not included in this list, like Partina alterniflora, which is used in coastal restoration. But this is a first step. This is a pilot. So next slide, please. Our next steps for the network, many next, I'll just touch on one that the Ecological Health Network is going to start this summer, is a participatory data collection, analysis, and synthesizing effort to understand more about market demand. We know there's demand surge, but we're not really sure how that breaks down into markets. And the National Academy of Sciences report also found poor demand signal or inconsistent demand signal really prevents a thriving seed industry, and it's especially disadvantages small growers. And in the Northeast, we have many small growers. So we've developed a list of 700 potential end users, and we're going to be sending a survey and learning more about what the needs are so that we can come back to our network of producers and help them develop a demand plan and really understand what the market segment in the Northeast. Next slide, please. And another major effort of the Ecological Health Network is developing a second and complementary network to the seed network. We call this the Bioregional Holistic Network. And this is really the other side of the coin of this. You know, we're working on the supply, generating the supply, and we need to also not only understand the demand, but make sure that we can this demand much closer together. And so what we'd like to do is build an inventory as a first step to bringing together active ecological restoration sites and many other allied activity sites in the Northeast into a network, along with the many diverse social actors who have stakes in advancing regional ecological restoration. We want to carry out collaborative research with our partners to learn more about the challenges and opportunities to scaling up ecological restoration in our region. And we want to work towards co-developing a vision for our bioregion that repairs ecological degradation and social fragmentation while increasing our collective resilience to rapid environmental change. Slide, please. So we know that many different types of activities are happening in our region, and James about this before with the restoration continuum and the family of restoration activities. And we would like to work to support site projects through building their connections within the network of diverse social actors, again with enhancing communication and the capacity for increased collaboration and coordination to work effectively throughout our region. Next slide. And we realize that this is an ambitious goal, but we believe that we can embrace such complexity through trusted partnerships. And we're working on building a network, and this is why we're so thrilled and so honored to be at this webinar today, because the New York Invasive Species Research Institute and the Risk Network of the Northeast, you are veteran networkers, and we are looking forward to working closely together with you, but also learning more about how to catalyze, convene, and facilitate successful networks. So I would say that for the SEED network, we are in the network evolution phases of connection, alignment, and somewhat production. I think that developing that target and priority species list was the first joint product network. We produced that the separate entities could not produce alone. And for the bioregional restoration network, we're really at the early stages of trying to form links between people and sites and understanding who's working on restoration in the region and what those gaps, barriers, opportunities are. Next slide, please. So,
Sure. Yes, going back to this vision of our Earth and the role of ecological restoration has evolved, and as it continues to spread and evolve, there's truly a message of hope here. It's a big ask, but a very timely one to talk without beating around the bush about a need to move from an extractive to restorative culture. And there are many tools and a growing number of networks pulling and pushing in the same direction. We would like to be part of this and hope that you find interest and that we can stay in touch and further about collaboration.
Next slide, please. So there's two main ways to get involved and to learn more about our efforts. If you're interested in joining the Northeast Seed Network, please fill out our network survey. And if you're interested in joining and learning more about our bioregional restoration network, please fill out our EHN contact form. Both of those links Justin just dropped in the chat. You can also email us at a later date, and we'll be happy to send these links to you then as well. Next slide, please. We also just wanted to mention for anyone who might be in Quebec City next week at the Society for Ecological Restoration RE3 conference that we will be there facilitating 2 symposia on Tuesday, June 13th. The first one is about Indigenous-oriented ecological restoration and rehabilitation in Southeast Canada and the Northeast US. And then we will be presenting later that afternoon about holistic ecological restoration. Next slide, please. There are some references from slides. Next. And that's it. So thank you so much. These are our email addresses. And if you have any specific questions about the Northeast Seed Network, that can be directed to the network email address, the seednetwork@nativeplanttrust.org.
Thank you so much, Eve and James, for the great presentation. Oh,
It's okay. We're finished. Thank you.
oh, you cut out for a minute, so I thought you had wrapped up. Thank you both for the great presentation and all the good information that was there, and also for working with us through some of the audio difficulties. Eve, if you want to turn on your camera now that we're not sharing the screen, it would be great to see you both as we do the Q&A, unless it doesn't work out. Good to see you both. So we have a number of questions that have come up in the Q&A box. And for those of you in the audience, please feel free to continue to drop your questions in. We do have scheduled till 2:30, so we have some time. Well, first, I'm just going to start off on a basic question that came up a couple of times, and that's about whether you're willing to share your slides or PDFs from the presentation, and also whether any of the research, specifically the research on the groupings and interactions, the network of consumers, producers, and influencers, is published somewhere, if there's a report available.
Yes, we're very happy to share our slides, and we can do that. We can follow up slides, and we are working on a right now. It's in preparation, and we'll hopefully fly. And so when it is ready to share, we can share it.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks. And what we can be sure to do is make that available on our website following, like together with the presentation, and we will send out a follow-up for folks within the webinar with that information. And okay, so we do have a number of questions here. Justin just put a chat in the chat box with the link to the feedback survey for the New York Invasive Species Awareness Week. So if you need to start dropping off here, please be sure to fill that out as you're going. But our next question is from Gary Fish, and he's interested to know what you think about the Half Earth project started by E.O. Wilson.
Well, the idea is great. It's not very likely to be adopted widely. It's a bit like the rewilding movement. I think of it as aspirational rather than a blueprint, and to be used with moderation wherever it is useful. But I would emphasize that ecological restoration and allied activities are always context specific. So it's important to look at your ecoregion or bioregion and your landscapes and see who the other people interested in restoration are around you, or if you're engaged with active restoration with seeds and plants, think about the supply chain social network ideas, and then think about networking among networks as a way forward. You want to add anything to that?
Thanks, James. And so our next question comes from Sylvan Ashbrook. How do you manage expectations of several groups together to come to a consensus on how ecological restoration looks?
Well, if it's people working in the same context. It's not easy, but it's at least framed both in biophysical terms, ecological terms, and social terms. The other way where there's not a single shared context is to think about general principles for the different activities. The ideas that I was talking about, ecosystem of reference, for example, can be, in theory, applied anywhere in the planning stages and for monitoring stages. And in terms of actual interventions, it's useful to think about the ecosystem type where you're working, or the landscape type, or both, and see what's been done around the world in that ecosystem type, and compare and experiment. We're still in very early stages, so it's good to try to approach any restoration project with an experimental approach. Be prepared to gather the information and share it with others as part of the process. And what I think that one of the biggest challenges right now, and that the EHN, the Ecological Health Network, is deeply committed to, is to try to get more integration and consenting with the different actors, and then monitoring of how things evolve in the social and socio-economic and cultural domain over the course of time. There's almost nothing published about these things. So that's a big challenge to take on.
Thanks so much for that answer. We do have a request here to share the references again, to show the references again. I know we're going to make those available as follow-up, but Audrey, I don't know if you have the ability to share a screen with that. I'm assuming that was Eve's references slide while we're continuing through the questions. There we go. Thanks so much, Audrey. Okay, so I'm going to skip around a little bit so we can cover, we have a couple of questions from the same folks. So I want to just make sure that everybody at least gets one question answered. No, a couple of, is there a role for very small or micro sites in urban and suburban environmental environments in restoration? Like a disconnected quilt of tiny ecological islands. That was from Elizabeth Bone.
Certainly there's a place for it, a need for it, and hopefully integration among the sites, so that both for education purposes and community building purposes and hope that small sites can be linked together. We recently visited some sites like that in the Dorchester region of Boston that grew out of a wonderful school system there, and there are other examples around the world. The cities can get involved, and so it's not just not-for-profits, but also the hall and agencies that can contribute to this, and the park system, as well as the educational systems and the health system.
Great, thanks so much. Our next question is, do you think a large-scale urban community garden network can play a part in generating locally adapted species for ecological restoration?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's important to, again, consider where the demand might be for that plant material that would be produced in an urban, but we working, for example, with the North Organic Farming Association, their Connecticut chapter, which is working to bring urban farmers to train them, to get them the resources and the training necessary for them to become seed farmers in urban areas. And there's some benefits to that as well, due to, there's the seeds are, or the plants are isolated from other plant communities, and so they can maintain the maternal lines easier. So we're on that, but it's, I think, important. I think that maybe those native plants would go right back into a local urban ecosystem restoration project.
Wonderful. And we have another question here from Gary. What is regenerative agriculture? How do you define this?
Regenerative or regenerative organic agriculture, I think, has a primary focus on restoring soil fertility and soil health, which is one of the major ways that it led to the ecological restoration movement. The soil health is essential to terrestrial ecosystem health, and in addition is arguably essential to human health. So healthy soils, produce healthy people. And there are many iterations of it, but I think the name regenerative organic farming is a pretty good one. And so I think that's my best shot at it.
Well, thank you so much. I don't see any other question. Oh, we do. Elizabeth Bone has another question here for Eve, asking if you can give more examples of small scale seed producers and what does that business look like?
Yes, it's a good question. And we are working again with that group, NOFA Connecticut, and that group was started to understand how small-scale organic farmers could be growers in our region. And there was a spin-off project that's called the Eco 59 Seed Collective. And so I would recommend for you to look at what they're doing. They're a network member and partner, and they're working on building collaborative organic farmers that will grow the seeds, and then they have almost like a central commissary where they're doing the seed cleaning and bringing all of the seeds together so that they can put it under one label and sell it under one label. So it works as a, and we think that's a wonderful model for the Northeast, and we have a dream and a vision that this model can be replicated to any of the other states through the NOFA chapters.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question here from Gary, and I guess I'm assuming he's asking specifically how are state agencies influencing this. I'm assuming this is ecological restoration, and what can we do to be more helpful? So Gary, feel free to clarify if I interpreted that wrong. That's it. I got it. Okay, so Gary would like to know how state agencies are influencing ecological restoration and what they could do to be more helpful. Gary comes from the state of Maine, so.
Well, when I was talking about state agencies, I was referring to the and social network analysis. One methodologies is using centrality metrics to understand the relative importance of nodes in the network. And we used a centrality metric that allowed us to understand which nodes are influential. So we carried out that analysis. We saw that state level agencies had a high degree of one of the measures that indicated their relative importance in the network as being highly influential or having wide-reaching, and so they're optimally positioned to be helpful. And we have some ideas of how they could be helpful, but we want to, essentially start to build connections with state level agencies around the Northeast. And this is something that we're going to be working with state level agency, and you're interested in developing a relationship with us or learning more about what we're doing and figuring out how we could collaborate, I think that would be a great first step. James, I'm not sure if you'd like to add anything.
No, that's pretty good.
All right. Well, we're getting towards the end of our time, and it looks like you've addressed all the questions from our audience. So with that, I just wanted to thank you both again for the great presentation, for taking the time to share all this information, and for all your work to advance restoration and the seed supply network. And we look forward to working with you moving forward. Again, please fill out the survey as you're leaving, and we'll be following up with information on the presentations and any other resources that were mentioned. So with that, we conclude our State of the Science webinar. We hope you enjoy the rest of Invasive Species Awareness Week. Check out the events, and please do get involved with your local PRISMs if you're here in New York. So take care and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carrie, Audrey, and